August 17th, 1943. The morning sky over southern Germany was filled with the drone of engines, a sound so deep it seemed to press down on the earth itself. German townspeople looked up and saw what appeared to be a moving wall of silver, hundreds of American bombers stretching from horizon to horizon. This was the first Schweinfurt Regensburg raid, one of the most daring missions the United States Army Air Forces had ever launched in Europe. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe scrambling from their airfields, the sight was unnerving. They were trained hunters, accustomed to single duels in the sky, where skill and nerve could tilt the balance. But what rose before them that morning was not a formation of vulnerable bombers. It was a fortress armada. Each aircraft bristled with machine guns in the nose, tail, dorsal, and belly, every approach covered. Closing in meant flying directly into converging streams of .50 caliber fire, a gauntlet that shredded men and machines alike. As the German fighters dove, tracer rounds carved bright scars across the clouds. AB-17 staggered under the assault, smoke pouring from one engine, yet it did not fall. Another fortress slid into its place, guns blazing, the formation tightened as if welded together. For every bomber that went down, others pressed forward, their payloads aimed at the heart of Germany's war industry. By the end of the day, losses were heavy on both sides. But in the memories of German pilots, one truth stood out. Attacking the flying fortress was unlike attacking any other bomber. It was an experience that turned courage into dread, skill into desperation, and every mission into a gamble with death. This was the machine that transformed the hunter into the hunted, the B-17 Flying Fortress. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, it faced an air war in Europe that was already defined by destruction and attrition. The British Royal Air Force had learned the hard way that daylight bombing raids were costly beyond measure. German fighters and flak guns tore apart unescorted bombers. And in 1940 and 1941, the RAF had shifted almost entirely to night bombing, trading accuracy for survival. British planners accepted the shadows, hitting cities and industrial regions in vast area raids, knowing that precision was nearly impossible in darkness. The Americans disagreed. The doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces was built around the belief that strategic targets could be destroyed with accuracy from high altitude, provided the bombers were tough enough to endure enemy fire. They wanted to cripple Germany's oil production, its ball-bearing factories, its rail networks, those precise nodes that kept the war machine alive. To do that, the USAF needed an aircraft that could go deep into enemy territory in daylight, survive fierce resistance, and return with enough accuracy to make every mission count. That vision set the stage for the B-17. The challenge was immense. No other air force in the world had managed to sustain daylight precision raids over a modern industrial power defended by one of the most capable air forces on Earth. The Luftwaffe in 1942 was still formidable with experienced pilots, fast Messerschmitt Bf-109s and deadly Focke-Wulf FW-190s. A bomber had to withstand their attacks while carrying enough payload to justify the risk. The B-17 promised exactly that: long-range, heavy defensive firepower, and an armored frame that could take punishing damage. The scale of American production ensured the idea was not just theoretical. By 1945, more than 12,700 B-17s had been built, each at a cost of around $238,000, a figure that underscored America's industrial might. Boeing led production, but Douglas and Lockheed's Vega division joined to meet the overwhelming demand. This was not a boutique weapon. It was a mass-produced instrument of strategy, delivered in staggering numbers. Politically, the B-17 also symbolized America's commitment to its allies. While Britain's bombers dominated the night skies, American formations would strike in daylight, keeping pressure on Germany around the clock. The round-the-clock bombing campaign was not just a military tactic. It was a message to friend and foe alike that the Allies would not relent. Every fortress that lifted off from bases in England carried not only bombs, but also the weight of a strategy designed to grind the Reich into submission. for German planners. The growing presence of these bombers presented a terrifying problem. The Luftwaffe had been built around fast, decisive strikes, supporting blitzkrieg on the ground. It had not been designed to defend against massive, sustained strategic bombing. The more B-17s arrived in Europe, the clearer it became that Germany would have to stretch its fighter force thin, defending multiple industrial centers at once. The problem was not only the loss of factories, but the exhaustion of pilots and fuel that came with countering an enemy that seemed endless. The problem for the Americans, however, was whether the B-17 could actually deliver on its promise. Could it truly survive the concentrated fury of the Luftwaffe? Could daylight raids succeed where the British had already concluded the cost was unbearable? The answer to those questions would be tested in blood, smoke, and fire over the heart of Europe. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress began not in wartime urgency, but in the mid-1930s when the United States Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a long-range bomber. Boeing's engineers answered with a Model 299, a sleek, all-metal monoplane that first took flight in July 1935. It was larger, faster, and more heavily armed than anything the Air Corps had imagined. A Seattle reporter, impressed by its bristling machine guns, coined the name Flying Fortress, a title that stuck and would become legend. The aircraft was revolutionary for its time. Its foreright, our 1820 Cyclone radial engines, gave it both speed and endurance, cruising at nearly 287 miles per hour with a maximum range of over 2,000 miles. The B-17 service ceiling reached 35,000 feet, allowing it to operate above much of the flak and beyond the reach of early enemy fighters. But what truly set it apart was its defensive design. With up to 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns mounted in powered turrets and flexible positions covering the nose, tail, waist, and top, the B-17 could throw out a withering crossfire in every direction. The fuselage was heavily built, with armor protection around vital areas and self-sealing fuel tanks to limit fire. Crews often marveled at how their fortresses could limp home with gaping holes in the wings, or with entire sections of the tail barely hanging on. Stories of B-17s making it back to England with 2 engines dead, control surfaces shredded, and crews wounded became part of its mystique. Still, the design involved compromises. The B-17 could not carry as heavy a bomb load as some of its contemporaries. Its standard payload was around 4,800 pounds of bombs, significantly less than the British Avro Lancaster, which could haul up to 14,000 pounds. The American Liberator, the B-24, carried more bombs and had longer range, but it lacked the same rugged survivability. In short, the B-17 was not the heaviest hitter, but it was the toughest. The cost reflected this balance of strength and technology. Each unit was priced at approximately $238,000 in wartime dollars, a figure justified by its durability and by the belief that fewer crews would be lost per mission compared to lighter, more fragile bombers. Compared to Germany's own designs, the difference was stark. The Luftwaffe relied on medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111 or Junkers Ju-88, which carried smaller loads and had much less defensive firepower. The B-17 represented not just a step forward, but a leap into a new philosophy, a bomber that could defend itself. By the time America entered the war, Boeing, along with Douglas and Vega, had already geared up to mass-produce the Fortress. What began as a prototype in the 1930s would soon fill the skies of Europe in the thousands. Mini CTA, before we dive into the first battles, LTC War Documentary has a quick question for you. How much bomb load do you think the B-17 Flying Fortress could carry at maximum capacity? A, 6 tons. B, 7 tons. C, 8 tons. You have 5 seconds to think. Comment below with your answer. We'll reveal the correct one before the end of this video. The baptism of fire for the B-17 came on August 17, 1942, when 12 fortresses of the 97th Bomb Group launched from England to strike a railway marshalling yard at Rouen, France. It was a carefully chosen target, close to the coast and within range of friendly escort fighters. The raid was led by Major Paul Tibbets, later known as the pilot of the Enola Gay, and it demonstrated in a single afternoon what the flying fortress could become. The mission was completed in daylight, with bombs falling squarely on target, and every aircraft returned home. To American planners, it was vindication. Daylight precision bombing was possible. But Germany was not idle. By 1943, when American bomber streams pushed deeper into the Reich, the Luftwaffe was waiting in force. The Schweinfurt, Regensburg raids became defining moments. Hundreds of B-17s lifted into the sky, their formations stretching for miles. German controllers scrambled Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in waves, sometimes committing entire fighter divisions to tear holes in the bomber streams. For the German pilots, the experience was unnerving. Attacking a B-17 formation meant flying into a blizzard of fire. They described it as charging a wall of guns, where tracers came from every angle and survival was a matter of luck. One Luftwaffe veteran recalled the sound of .50 caliber rounds slamming into his FW-190 as he tried to close the distance. It was like flying into a furnace. Even when they downed a fortress, the price was often another fighter lost or crippled. For the Americans inside the bombers, the reality was no less brutal. Crews sat in cramped compartments with frost on their oxygen masks, hearing the thud of flak and the rip of cannon shells. Gun positions lit up as enemy fighters roared in. Many fortresses came back with engines aflame, fuselages riddled with holes, and gunners wounded or killed. Yet, astonishingly, some aircraft limped home with wings shredded or entire sections of the tail missing. This resilience reinforced the mythos of the flying fortress as the bomber that could always bring its crew back. The comparison to other Allied bombers was striking. The German pilots knew that the B-24 Liberator, though faster and capable of carrying heavier loads, was more fragile. Many Luftwaffe aces admitted they chose to attack Liberators first, believing a short burst of 20mm cannon fire could ignite them. Against the British Avro Lancaster, encountered mostly at night, the feeling was different. Night fighters hunted in darkness, relying on radar and stealth. It was dangerous work, but it did not carry the same visceral dread as diving into the blinding defensive fire of a B-17 box formation under the sun. The losses on both sides told the story. In the first Schweinfurt raid of August 1943, 60 B-17s were shot down in a single day, nearly 20% of the attacking force. But the Luftwaffe also lost dozens of its irreplaceable veteran pilots. Each clash drained Germany of fuel, aircraft, and experience, while the Americans, backed by an industrial engine that seemed limitless, sent more fortresses to take their place. By the winter of 1943, both sides understood what the B-17 represented. For the Americans, it was a weapon of strategy and endurance, the proof that daylight bombing could hammer Germany into submission. For German fighter pilots, it was an opponent unlike any other, one that turned every sortie into a gamble with survival, where courage was swallowed by the sound of guns. By late 1943, the B-17 was no longer just an experimental tool of daylight bombing. It had become the central pillar of the Allied strategic air campaign. The United States and Britain had divided the skies into a relentless schedule. At night, the RAF's Lancasters and Halifaxes swept over Germany, pounding cities in vast area raids. By day, American B-17s and B-24s struck industrial plants, rail yards, and oil refineries. Together, this round-the-clock bombing left the German economy and population under constant pressure. The strategic aim was not only to destroy factories, but to force the Luftwaffe into combat on terms that favored the Allies. Every fortress that entered German airspace drew fighters into the air, draining fuel reserves and exposing pilots to attrition. Losses among bomber crews were devastating. Tens of thousands of Americans would never return, but the exchange bled Germany more heavily. Unlike the United States, the Reich lacked the manpower and industry to replace its losses indefinitely. Tactically, the B-17 formations became infamous for their combat box strategy. By flying in tight, overlapping layers, the defensive arcs of each aircraft covered the others, creating an almost impenetrable wall of fire. A Luftwaffe pilot attacking from the rear might find himself under fire from half a dozen bombers at once. Even head-on approaches, favored by German aces, carried lethal risk. The effect was psychological as much as physical. German pilots spoke of the blinding wall of tracers, of closing their eyes in the final seconds before firing, praying their cannons struck home before the fortress gunners found their mark. Desperate to counter this, Germany experimented with new tactics and weapons. Heavy cannon-armed fighters like the FW-190 Sturmbach were reinforced to survive the defensive fire long enough to blast bombers at close range. Rockets, such as the Werfer Granit 21, were mounted beneath fighters to break up formations from a distance. Night fighters were occasionally thrown into daylight operations. Most dramatically, the Luftwaffe rushed forward the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, whose speed promised to shatter the bomber streams. Yet none of these solutions came fast enough or in sufficient numbers. The Sturmbach units suffered high casualties. The rocket attacks caused disruption but rarely destroyed enough aircraft to matter. The Me-262 arrived too late, hampered by Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber rather than purely as an interceptor. The Luftwaffe's once dominant force of seasoned pilots steadily eroded, replaced by young, under-trained flyers hurled into impossible battles against waves of fortresses and, increasingly, their escorts. That escort was decisive. In 1944, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed the dynamic entirely. Long-range Mustangs could accompany B-17s deep into Germany, slashing down German fighters before they reached the bombers. What had once been bloody, near-suicidal raids now became offensives that the Allies could sustain. Germany's fuel plants at Ploesti, ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, and aircraft works at Regensburg all came under steady assault, crippling the Reich's ability to sustain modern war. From a German perspective, the psychological weight grew unbearable. Pilots knew that attacking a B-17 formation was a gamble with their lives. Entire squadrons could be decimated in a single mission. Diaries and post-war interviews recall the dread of seeing contrails stretching across the sky, knowing that what lay ahead was not just a fight, but a gauntlet of steel and fire. For the Americans, every fortress lost carried the grief of 10 men, but the machinery of production ensured replacements. For the Germans, every veteran lost was a wound that never healed. By 1945, the Flying Fortress had proven its point. Daylight raids had not only been possible, they had become a decisive weapon that broke the back of Germany's war economy and left the Luftwaffe a shadow of its former self. By the final months of World War II, the B-17 Flying Fortress had carved its name indelibly into the skies over Europe. It was not invulnerable. Thousands had been shot down, and the casualty rate among bomber crews was among the highest of any branch of the U.S. military. Yet its legend was not born from invincibility, but from endurance. Time and again, fortresses brought home crews and aircraft that looked as if they should have fallen apart long before reaching friendly lines. That resilience became a symbol of hope for those inside, and a mark of dread for those who opposed them. Production of the B-17 ended in April 1945, with more than 12,700 built. The aircraft remained in American service into the early post-war years, before being supplanted by the more modern B-29 Superfortress. However, the B-17's operational life did not end there. Many were transferred to Allied nations under programs of aid and surplus distribution. Countries in South America and Europe flew them for years after the war, in roles ranging from maritime patrol to transport. Some were even adapted for firefighting, dropping water, and retardant over forest blazes rather than bombs over cities. Now, let's return to the question posed earlier. How much bomb load could the B-17 Flying Fortress carry at maximum capacity? The options were 6, 7, or 8 tons. The correct answer is C, 8 tons. while the standard payload was around 4,800 pounds for long-range missions. The Fortress could be configured for short-range missions to carry as much as 17,600 pounds of bombs, just under 8 tons. This was rare and limited, but it demonstrated the remarkable capacity hidden within its design. In assessing its role, historians often weigh the cost against the effect. The B-17 was not the heaviest bomber, nor the most efficient. The British Lancaster dropped more bombs. The American B-24 flew farther and faster. Yet the Flying Fortress earned its reputation because it was the right machine for the doctrine America chose: daylight precision bombing. It proved that such raids, though costly, could be sustained, and in doing so it helped drain Germany's war economy and its fighter force. After the war, the B-17 became more than a weapon. It became a cultural icon. Survivors were preserved in museums, restored to flight, and immortalized in films such as Memphis Belle. Veterans wrote of their experiences, describing the bomber as both a prison of fear and a vessel of salvation. For many, the sight of a battered fortress limping back to base, riddled with holes yet still airborne, captured the spirit of endurance that defined the Allied struggle. The legacy of the B-17 is therefore measured not only in tons of bombs dropped, but in the way it reshaped the conduct of air war. It was a machine that demonstrated the power of industrial might, the courage of air crews, and the vulnerability of even the strongest defenders when faced with relentless pressure. Long after the last mission was flown, the B-17 Flying Fortress remained more than a machine of rivets, engines, and guns. For the men who flew in them, and for those who watched them thunder overhead, the Fortress became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and resolve. It was a weapon, but also a cultural artifact that shaped how nations remember the war. In the United States, the B-17 stood as proof of industrial power married to courage. Posters of flying fortresses filled recruiting stations, often showing bombers wingtip to wingtip across the sky, a vision of unstoppable might. To soldiers on the ground in Europe, the sight of a formation passing overhead meant reassurance that the enemy's rear areas were under constant assault. For German civilians, that same sight was a harbinger of destruction, a daily reminder that the war was being carried directly into their cities and factories. In popular culture, the fortress gained an enduring life. Films like Memphis Belle dramatized its missions, capturing the claustrophobic fear of flak bursts and the camaraderie of 10 men locked together in a fragile cocoon of aluminum. Museums across America and Europe preserve restored examples, often with crews of veterans guiding visitors through the narrow fuselages, pointing to gun positions and patched aluminum, telling stories of comrades lost and homecomings against impossible odds. These aircraft stand not just as relics, but as monuments, embodying a chapter of history where survival itself felt like victory. Symbolically, the B-17 represented the idea of the bomber as a strategic instrument, a weapon that could reach deep into enemy territory, not only to destroy but to compel. This belief carried forward into the Cold War, where fleets of strategic bombers like the B-52 Stratofortress patrolled the skies as visible reminders of deterrence. The very name Fortress echoed in later designs, a lineage of symbolism as much as technology. Militarily, the lessons of the B-17 shaped doctrine for decades. Its combination of range, durability, and defensive armament reinforced the conviction that air power could be decisive in breaking an enemy's capacity to wage war. Though later bombers would rely on speed, altitude, and stealth rather than gun turrets, the fundamental idea of the bomber as the cornerstone of strategic power was cemented in part by the Fortress's legacy. In Germany, the memory was darker. Luftwaffe veterans often spoke of the futility of confronting bomber streams. They described contrails stretching endlessly across the horizon, the sound of their engines echoing like an approaching storm. In post-war interviews, many admitted that the B-17 symbolized not just destruction but inevitability, the sense that no matter how fiercely they fought, the tide of war could not be turned back. For them, the fortress was not only a target, but a nightmare etched into memory. Today, only a few dozen B-17s remain airworthy, their engines still rumbling into the skies at air shows. When they fly, spectators often fall silent, listening to the deep growl of four engines and imagining what thousands once sounded like. Each surviving aircraft carries the weight of thousands of lost missions, a bridge between living memory and history. The B-17 Flying Fortress terrified German pilots, not only because of its guns or armor, but because it represented a war machine backed by a nation's unshakable resolve. It was the embodiment of endurance in aluminum and steel, a fortress that flew through fire and returned. In the end, its true legacy lies not in the tons of bombs dropped, but in the enduring image of a battered machine refusing to fall, a symbol of a war fought to the finish and of the cost that victory demanded.